Disclaimer. The information and education material contained herein is meant to promote the general understanding and dialogue of GAN's processing. Such information is not meant or intended to serve as a substitute for a healthcare professional's clinical training, experience, or judgment. For patients and individuals, such information is not to be a substitute for professional medical, therapeutic, or healthcare advice or counseling. For medical issues or concerns, including decisions about medications and other treatments, readers, viewers, listeners should always consult their physician or, in serious cases, seek immediate assistance from emergency personnel. Prescription information, procedures, and use of medical devices information should be undertaken only by properly trained and certified medical personnel. We specifically disclaim any warranties, express or implied, including implied warranties of merchantability or fitness for a particular purpose. Such information is provided, as is, and is believed to be accurate at the time of its publishing, but it is the viewer's job to evaluate the accuracy of any information found in this presentation. Every case presented is of their own experience, applied by themselves for themselves, and it applies to their case only. Every person experiencing health problems should seek professional medical advice and consult their course of treatment with a doctor. The processes of plasma balancing described herein are a natural process which supports the body but does not replace medical advice or therapies one is already subject to.
So much, everybody. I hope you're having a good day.
Better now that you've come in.
Okay. Thank you very much. I think we're getting used to the new updates on this platform. So I want to welcome everybody on this beautiful Sunday afternoon, and I want to thank all the panelists here for making this such an important meeting, because we have representations from pretty well all the continents. It's very important because things are changing, and there's a lot of people who are totally oblivious to all the changes, and so this becomes a serious problem. Because who do they turn to? Well, they're going to have to turn to the same people that we had to turn to. And that is that we had to depend on ourselves. We had to depend on our friends. And we had to depend on the knowledge. And so this is how we bring the team together. And this is the Keshe American Knowledge Team for 2025. Bringing you the Keshe Foundation Spaceship Institute teachings on plasma science. Yes, we're still in the intermediate inertia series. We are discussing about dependency today. My name is Alexander. I am from Canada. It is February the 23rd, 2025. And this is part of the Keshe Foundation North America Plasma Education Series. And it's a continuation of what we've been doing for the last 4 years, because we have a lot to talk about, but also it's been a problem for a lot of people because there are thousands of hours of teaching and not everyone is interested in devoting that much time. So we try and distill it down into a more compact package. And the jury is still out whether we're succeeding in that. So we have to distill it around even more, double distill it, or even triple distill it. But, you know, we seem to be referred to as the four-wheeler foodies. And so it means that we are really attached to this dependency. And so what does dependency mean exactly? So seeing as we're on the hesitancy highway, our physicality is in the lowest energy state. And we are at the frontier crossroads now, because we start to realize that our physicality is not the only state. We have lots of other states of energy, but we love our chuck wagon tailgate parties, don't we? And of course, now that the football season is over, we see how important it was, because we had to have accurate field goal kickers and we had to depend on them. They affect the outcome of the games. And in between all the grunting and the shoving and all the beautiful physical specimens displaying their wares. But here we are searching for outer space, and we're trying to have another kind of joy. And our joy really depends on the potholes on the way to that plasma highway to our little pie in the sky. And that is part of the problem, because we're all trying to find that little pie in the sky, and we have found it. So we keep looking for that little pie in the sky, you know, maybe going to the darkest jungles to find that elusive cure for cancer, ignoring the fact that the majority of our atmosphere is nitrogen. Makes you wonder why. So the why begins in understanding book number 1 as presented by Marin Tevakoli-Kesh. We're talking about the universal order of creation of matter. And so that matter is what matters to us, isn't it? Because we're in the physical matter state. But we're not all in the physical matter state, because some of us are kind of in a emotional state. And emotional states are not very physical, except that there are consequences of being in that state. So our physicality and our well-being depends on our emotional state. And so this is the difference between the plasma matter and the physical matter. And since we have this interdependency, then we see from book number 2, now we understand the structure of the light, because to go somewhere and come from somewhere, you have to depend on that somewhere to exist. And that's pretty important too, because since we came to this planet, we had to depend on this planet being here before us. And then the question comes in, how did we know? Well, it's a good thing it was here, because otherwise we wouldn't have been here. We would have been somewhere else. But we came here as opposed to Mars, for instance. Why? So there was a reason. And that reason is exemplified in book number 3, The Origin of the Universe. And so we see the origin of the universe also has its dependency, where, well, we have our universe, our little tiny perfect universe, but we have a sister universe. And that sister universe is not very physical, but there it is again. It is drawing energy. And so if it's drawing that energy, and it itself is not physical, as it appears to us, and we see our universe, and it is physical, and of course it's drawing energy, and then of course we're on that universe, and we're drawing energy, and everybody's on this planet, and they're drawing energy. Are we consuming all the energy in the universe? Or are there others who are also consuming energy? Or are there others who are wasting energy? And where exactly are those others? And so one of the things we have to do is prepare, just like we did the Earth. We had to prepare the Earth before we arrived here. Now we have to prepare the Universal Council. So for 366 weeks in a row, we brought one planet, one nation, one race for justice and world peace. And this was brought to you by Rick Trammon and the Universal Council. And if it's a Universal Council, is it just restricted to Earth? Because Earth is just one part of the universe, isn't it? So what's going on in the other part? Or are we going to ignore that other part and just be content with our little tiny perfect world? So in order to understand our little tiny perfect world, we have to follow rules. Well, who wrote those rules? So it seems like it says Moses did the rules. But where did he get them from? And the problem with the initial 10 commandments is most of them shall not. And of course, energy is positive and not is not positive. And so being positive beings, we don't hear not. A not doesn't work in our little world. And how do we know that? Well, because it just seems that those 10 commandments are not being followed by most of us. So it's nice to have them, but it seems like those are man-made rules, and they are there in lieu of the universal rules. And part of the problem could be the fact that we're missing another 14 commandments. And it just means that we have more rules. But who wrote these rules? And who believes these rules? And why do they apply to us? Why are they so necessary to apply to us? Do they apply to others in the universal community? And if we are part of the universal community, then it only stands to reason that these rules transcend the other universal communities. It only makes sense. So when we're looking at our progress, we're trying to get on this plasma highway. And we find that this plasma highway is so far removed from what we've been accustomed to. We've been on the transmission highway. So we understand frequency and heat and pressure. And it's the lowest energy state. And part of that reference is carbon-12, which is on the periodic table of elements. But there is a transition highway, as we've discussed in the past, and it elevates to the isotopes of carbon-14 and carbon-10. But now there's a relationship, and it could go one way or the other. But the thing is, the combination is 24, again, like our commandments. And then if we go to one step higher, the transmutation highway, it's in another energy state, even higher. But now it involves carbon-16 and carbon-8, and yet the combination of those are also 24, just like the commandments. So it seems that carbon is an integral part of our existence. And so to understand this duality, we have to understand that the carbon is dependent on another form of carbon. And so in the physicality, we have to see how the carbon-12 works together with another carbon-12, and that gives us the carbon-24 on the transmission level. But now it highlights something completely different, and that's the ratio. The ratio of the carbon inertia. So on the lowest level, it's only 1-to-1, which kind of means that either they compound equally or they nullify each other. But if we were to go to the transition level, the carbon-14 to the carbon-10 has a ratio 1.4-to-1. Now we find that the ratio of the carbon inertia has increased. And if we go one step higher, now we have carbon-16 and carbon-8, and the ratio there is 2-to-1. So we have increased in our energy states, and we know the increase in the energy state is by an order of magnitude. But the ratio increase here is not by an order of magnitude. In fact, it looks more like a ratio increase that kind of follows the pH range. The pH range is just based on one step at a time, but each step is an order of magnitude. So what it looks like then is that the lowest level, the carbon-12, is in a range of 1, and the highest level, the plasma state, is in a range of 2, and the transition state is somewhere in between. And so where we are in this range from 1 to 2 is dependent. What is it dependent on? Well, that's what we're talking about today. We're talking about dependency. So if we're just looking at our physical state, now we come to the question, is what we see a reflection or is it an illusion? And are we still pioneers? Are we pioneers on this planet, or are we pioneering America? And after all these years, are we still pioneers? Well, let's ask another question. How big is large? Because the universe is really, really big and our tiny perfect world is really, really tiny. And so that separation really draws the attention of the difference between the weak nuclear forces and the strong nuclear forces. So we say the weak nuclear forces are far because we don't really feel them, and the strong nuclear forces are very near because we can feel those. But in fact, the strong nuclear forces are actually weak, but they're strong in relationship because they're near. Well, if the strong nuclear forces are weak, then the weak nuclear forces must be strong. And boy, you really have to be strong if you're going to rotate a planet around the sun. Right? Many of us are having trouble just with our own little tiny, perfect little world, which doesn't even involve the whole Earth. It just involves our little tiny portion of the Earth. And, if there's 8 billion of us here, then each of us has our 1/8 billionth of a portion. And that's pretty tiny. So, and we still have difficulty with that, don't we? So what we're having difficulty with is what we see, because what we see is what we get. And if what we see is what we get, where did it come from? So what we see is then the opposite of what we don't see. And so this becomes very reasonable because what we see is all the colors. And when we put all the colors together, that's white. But when we take all the colors away, well, that's black. No color. And so when we look into the blackness of outer space, then what we are seeing is only parts. So what exactly are we seeing? We're only seeing half the picture. And so in that regard, maybe we're just nickel and diming our understanding of what life is all about. Because we certainly can move between these carbon inertia ratios, because we have a plasma inertia junction on a high level where we could interact with a transition matter on a lower level, and we could interact with another transfer state dimension in the intermediate level. And so the inertia is a combination of the first two. So we start from one track and we move to another track. But we can also have a medium junction where the lower transition matter and higher transition matter bring together an inertia field of the transfer state dimension. But then we can also have a low junction, which is the opposite of the high junction, where we take from the transition matter of a higher track and the transfer state of an intermediary track and bring it down to the lowest transition matter state. So these are the transition states between the three basic dimensions. So these junctions can be viewed as either being half a picture in the lower state or half a picture in the higher state, or maybe there's a whole picture in the in-between state, but we really can't see that. We just know that we're only seeing half the picture. So what we're seeing is dependent on something that we can't see. Well, what kind of dependency is that? Do you trust that? Do you depend on that? Do you like depending on things you can't trust? Or do you have to trust that which you cannot see? So when we look at these surface to volume ratios, now we understand that really we have to go from a two-dimensional viewpoint to a three-dimensional viewpoint because it involves a sphere. So now it's 1 plus 1, not the same one, plus another one, not necessarily the same one. And we don't even know if it's a combination of another one. We just say that's one. And so bringing it all together is more than 3, which is the sum of all 3 ones, but we still have the 1. It's not like we've lost it. So in fact, the 2 feeding dimensions become 3 feeding dimensions. And so if we have 3 feeding dimensions, then we have to have 4 feedback dimensions because we still have the 2 or 3 feeding dimensions. And then the feedback dimension, the 4th feedback dimension is, well, it must be us because we're the ones who are seeing. And as such, we are also giving the feedback. And so if we're giving this feedback, then that feedback is dependent on what we see. But, there's a whole lot that we don't see. So, we just kind of have to fake it, right? We don't understand it. And if we can't see it, then how could we depend on it? And yet, we have to be dependable. So our dependability depends on the conservation of inertia, doesn't it? So when we look at the Magravs inertia transfer states, these are transfer states of energy. And so we know that there's a different energy state in the atomic state, the nanostate, and the GaN state. And these are 3 different energy states, but they're all in the physicality. and we see that they can interchange. So the most important thing is that there's a left side that's equal to the right side, where 1 and 1 is kind of 2. But the thing is, from our point of view, we have those 3 dimensions plus our point of view, and those dimensions are dependent on what we bring together. So we can bring everything together on each individual state, or we can jump from state to state. And somehow these things are in balance. Well, how can they be in balance? There must be something that we can't see. Because how can you balance something that's higher with something that's lower? And if you ever played on a teeter-totter, I think you'll understand. So in order for there to be a balance, it means we have to depend on something that we can't see. And so the thing that we really can't see is how the universe was created. And although we like to depend on batteries, we like to depend on air conditioners, we like to depend on furnaces. But ironically, the furnaces always break down in the winter and the air conditioners always break down in the summer. And of course, the batteries run out whenever they run out, and you can't see that energy. You could hold a battery. You can touch and feel the air conditioner and the stove, but you can't see the energy. And yet we are dependent on that. And that energy is positive. So the charge has to do with the motion, the direction of motion. And the reason for that is because energy is always in motion. So we need to know which way it's going, because all things are working in combination. So fundamentally, when we're looking at the universal order of creation of matters, the matter is dependent on the coming together of the antimatter, dark matter, and matter. Three energy states coming together, different energy states coming together in a balance where we have the one. And then, where did it come from? Well, that depends. And if it came from something else that was physical, it too had a creation of matter, the antimatter, dark matter, and matter. And so we understand that if the energy comes from one source and goes to the other, we understand that. And we kind of take it for granted. Like, you don't think about that when you jump in your car and drive to the grocery store, do you? But that, in fact, is what is happening. But it is happening in so many different ways. And we get kind of lax, and we get kind of used to it, and we get kind of lazy. So we, as humans, have to walk and then go into the car and then start the car and then drive the car and then park, turn off the car, go and get the groceries, come back to the car, start the car, drive back home. You all know the routine. It is a routine. We have to do that on a regular basis because we need the food for energy, and we exist because of that energy. But when the food runs out, we need to get more food, and so that food has to come from the energy. We take that for granted, but when we don't have the food and when we don't have the energy, then that becomes a part of conflict, a reason for conflict. And don't we need more reasons for conflict? So our conflict point is dependent. And sometimes we can't see what is dependent on. We just take it for granted. But in the plasma rule, the higher strength feeds the weaker strength, as opposed to the man-made rule, where the higher strength eats the weaker strength or dominates. And so that too becomes a conflict point. But in effect, it becomes a binding zone, whichever way you want to look at it, because if the higher strength is feeding the weaker strength, then there has to be a connection. If the stronger army is fighting the weaker army, then there has to be a connection. So whether it's a conflict point or it's a binding point, it is always a binding zone. So what we don't know and what it depends on is whether or not this binding zone is peaceful or it's warmongering. Just to say that it's a binding zone does not qualify anything. But we all are in a self-serving need for energy binding. And obviously, when we were born, we received that. But as we grew into adults, we became acclimatized to the operation on this planet, which is why we needed the commandments, because thou shalt not bind energy at the expense of others. But we do that. And so what happens? The others may become indignant, or the others may be seeking refuge so that they can continue to get their self-serving energy binding needs the way that they were accustomed to. But, we have a problem where we don't understand the core component. So in science, we refer to the electron. And because it's tiny, with an extremely high surface to volume ratio, we say it's magnetical. But then the electron existence depends. And what does it depend on? Well, it depends on the coming together of the matter, dark matter, and antimatter. So now it's an electron. But how do you know it's an electron? How do you know it's not a neutron? Because the core component of the neutron is the coming together of the matter, dark matter, and antimatter. And we say, well, the neutron is gravitational. Why is it gravitational? Well, because it has a lower surface to volume ratio. Lower than what? Well, that depends. And that depends on the relationship, the tensity of what we say is the magnetical gravitational balance, which we call a maggrav. So if we look at the way we conduct ourselves in life, and we look at the importance of the scientific community and their responsibility, well, they try and explain the balance of the conservation of magnetic fields versus the conservation of energy. But then there's another scientific community, the spiritual community, and they have a responsibility to understand the relationship between the spirit and the motor of the soul. But now you have these two sciences coming together in their understanding of their individual tensity relationship, but they have to come together with a tensity relationship, and that coming together is the inertia field of the plasma science. And the plasma science just adds to the knowledge. And so the question then is, what is the rate of change? And can we change the rate of change? And how long do we have to wait? Well, I don't know. How big is large? So, here we are. We're the four-wheelers of creation. And, we laugh when we see our kids learning to ride a bike and they have two training wheels. Some of us are only two-wheelers. Now, most of us are four-wheelers, and we don't necessarily drive them. We have people who drive us. We have buses and trains and planes. But the thing is that when we look at the creation, we find that it's a balance between the natural decay and natural creation. And so what is it that we're creating? Well, that depends. And it kind of depends on the balance between the outtensity and the intensity and what is the factor there. But if we are only looking at the creation aspect of it, what happens in the decay side? And is the decay side only in the physical side? But then the decay side also depends on the balance between the intensity and outtensity of the balance between the natural decay and the natural creation. So if one side has a dependency and the other side has a dependency, then clearly the inertia bonding factor has a dependency as well, because it depends on the outcome of the inertia of the creation and the outcome of the inertia of the decay and the balance thereof, which, we're only seeing what we see and taking that into account, and nothing else is kind of taken into account, except that we understand that there's a gravitational attraction and there's a magnetical repulsion. So this magnetical repulsion is part of the feeding cycle, and the gravitational attraction is part of the feedback cycle. So what we want to understand better is this attraction and this repulsion. So when we look at the combination of the magnetical dependency, we can say that an electron is an electron dependent on its relationship with the neutron. Therefore, we can say what a neutron is because it's dependent on an electron. Without the electron, you don't know if it's a neutron. And without the neutron, you don't know if it's an electron. So which electron and which neutron is it? Well, you don't know. It depends. It depends on the magnetical dependency of the relationship of the attraction and the repulsion. So we have made a selection dimension, right? We have this matter state plasma, which has created a matter state inertia. And through that inertia field, we have created humanity. But we've also created the chicken world and the lettuce world and the cow world and the fish world. And these are all part of matter state physicality. And each one of those worlds are gravitationally stable. And they're all part of the matter state. All follow the same rules, except in the plasma state, the stronger feeds the weaker. And in the physical state, yeah, well, we're the stronger, so we eat the weaker. And if we are eating the weaker, then we are getting less. So how do we get more? Well, that depends. Well, does it depend on how much we eat? So if we eat more, then we'll have more. But if we have more to eat more, then we will have more balance. And if we have more balance, then the gradient charge will be less. And less of a gradient charge will give us less energy. So there's something wrong with that logic. And so we have developed this contention dependency with respect to our humanity, because each of us is dependent on this earth space, and each of us is having our own little tiny perfect world on our tiny perfect world. And yet we discriminate and we isolate and we say, well, our peace of mind and our harmony and our prosperity is dependent on our neighbors. And so we find that, we have different civilizations, but there are confrontations, there are conflicts. And so those conflicts create a binding. Now that binding could be could be interdependency, or that binding could be a point of conflict, a war. And for some, the conflict becomes a matter of survival. And for others, it becomes a matter of what to do. In other words, the conflict becomes part of the dependency. So in order to have a conflict, you need to have a conflict and a neighbor to conflict with. So your conflict depends on your neighbor. Now, interestingly enough, if you're in business and you have a service to provide, so let's look at the practical application. You depend on your neighbor to buy your product or service. So you have a dependency there. Well, how does that dependency compare to the dependency on conflict? So in the one hand, you want your neighbor to have enough money to buy your goods and services. And on the other hand, if your neighbor doesn't buy your goods and services, then why don't we just have a conflict with the neighbor, and then we don't have to ask, we just take. And that becomes an acquired taste, an acquired dependency. In fact, it's a way of life. And so when we look at our history, we see that this humanity civilization has had a contention dependency throughout history. And when is that going to change? And how is it going to change? And who is going to change it? And so the answer, of course, well, it depends, right? So it depends on our understanding of why we call it the cups of life, and not the cups of the pandemic. So we were forced through a contentious issue to show the public how to take advantage of the monatomic science, which was at a higher energy state, produce the GANT science, which was at a higher energy state. And we did that with the physical science, which was at a lower energy state. So those are three energy states. But then we produced a variety of other ganses, and these ganses had different aspects to them. So everything from metals like zinc and copper, and other elements like carbon and calcium, but they were produced in molecular form, which meant that they were a combination. And look at water, hydrogen and oxygen, a combination. And then look at amino acids. That's an even more complex combination. And so what we find is that the more complex the combination, the more stable it is. And so this is how we came to realize the importance of plasma feeding. Because when we create a stable environment that can draw the energy from the universe the way all of us did, then we can focus on whether or not we're satisfied or whether we're hungry. And the ways and means that we get fed. And the ways and means depend on our sophistication in terms of our understanding. And that also depends on the sophistication of our neighbor's understanding. So here we are dependent on dependency. But when we look at the one-track cup of man, what does that depend on? So that depends on the relationship between the physical GANs and the emotional GANs. And we bring those two together, that's a reflection of the cup of man. But that's only one and one. If we bring another one, the cup of the soul, now we have the three dimensions. And what do we have? Well, we have the amalgam of those three dimensions into this fourth dimension, of which we are the observer. And so our observation is dependent on the emotional cup, the physical cup, and the cup of the soul. And is that all? What about the cup of the universe? And then we see the relationship of the brain, how it has a relationship with the copper, which is physical, the zinc, which is emotional, and the carbogen, which is the energy from the universe, and it comes together. And so all of that depends. And then the inertia of the mind has to somehow be converted into the inertia of the physicality. But the inertia of the physicality has to take into account the inertia of the physicality of the earth. And therefore, the soul of the physicality has to manifest from the inertia of the soul of the earth and the soul of the man. So the inertia of the mind depends on these other three dimensions to come together. And so when we're looking at what is our position on this planet, so it depends on our position on the planet. And of course, it depends on what we are, what we do, how we do it, when we do it. So everything kind of depends. So if you look at the Earth and use that as a grand central station of all these Ganses, so all of these Ganses are capable of creating an inertia field, and they all depend on a position on the Earth. And those are the things that we can see. What about the things that we can't see? How about the positional dependency of our little sentimental pie in the sky? Because where we are is on Earth, and where we are not is on the planets next to us. So we are not on Venus, and we are not on Mars. We are on Earth. But where is Earth? Well, it's somewhere between Jupiter and the sun. Well, where is the sun? Well, that depends because it keeps moving. In fact, the whole solar system keeps moving. And then within that solar system, we keep moving. And so do all the other planets, and they keep moving. So our positional dependency is based on these other planets, but they keep moving. So therefore, our position is dependent on that motion. So we have to move as well. Unfortunately, because of those weak nuclear forces taking care of our giant planet, we don't have to depend on that. That is taken care of for us. All what we have to depend on is what we are doing on this planet. And is that true? Because before we got here, we were depending on something else. So when we look at the periodic table of elements, we've decided that in order to organize it, we had to have these elemental protons. That is to say, the number of protons. And so we started with one, that was one proton. And then we started with, next one was two, that would be two protons. But at that point, we can add the number of neutrons. So either if we don't have a neutron at the number one position, then maybe the absence of a neutron is a neutron. Because doesn't a neutron depend on an electron in order for it to be a neutron? Well, or what about in the absence of a neutron, then is the proton a neutron? So then the question comes, can an element exist without a neutron? Well, if you consider that hydrogen doesn't have a neutron, because for the sake of the periodic table, each of these elements has one more proton. And so if you get down to zinc, it has 30 protons. And of course, one would assume that 30 protons would have 30 neutrons. But we didn't find that ratio to be uniform. We found it to change. So going back to the beginning, the neutron came before the atom and the PM tick. And so we said, let there be light, because the light comes from the darkness, right? So what we see is the light, and what we don't see is the darkness. So let's just forget about the darkness for now, because can't see anyway. Can't see in the dark. But we can't see the principal matter either, which are the PM ticks, because they're magnetical. Well, how do the PM ticks exist if they're magnetical? So they have to come together in a force field and dilute together into the antimatter, dark matter, and mattergen, and then convert into a plasmagen. But that's a plasmatic plasmagen. When does it become physical? Well, it has to have a place to do that. So we choose Earth, and so the Earth manifests in physicality, and we take the physical field of the Earth and the plasmatic field of our principal matter conversion and create a field interaction and develop a stable maggrav, which is gravitationally stable. We'll call that gravitational stable inertia, which we call gravity. So then we have the matter plasma dimension and understanding that there's a physical matter plasma that we can touch, but there's a plasmatic matter plasma. We can't touch it. But it has been a factor in our inertial creation. And what it has created was dependent. There was a dependency on this plasma, which we couldn't see. And it is through this plasma that we couldn't see and that we were dependent on that gave us this physical feedback. So we choose to be feedback dominant with our physicality. And therefore, we choose to be feedback dominant with our plasmatic matter state. And those are the only things that we rely on and become dependent on, because those are the only things that we can see. So the problem, of course, is, as we discussed mathematically, the neutron to proton ratio is variable. So the idea of if we had one proton with no neutron and then we had a second proton, then we would have two neutrons. Well, wait a second, we missed a step there. Kind of just jumped from 0 to 2. What happened to 1? Well, this is what we're saying. First of all, we see that the neutron mass is variable because the more protons we have, the more dense it becomes. The more dense it becomes, the more mass it has. And conversely, it has more neutrons because the neutrons are based on the divisibility of what we consider to be a neutron into the total mass. And so through that division, we arrive at the number of neutrons. So the number of neutrons is dependent on the mass. But when is a neutron a proton, and when is a proton a neutron? Because if we wanted to say that we go from no neutrons to two neutrons, we're missing the one neutron. Well, maybe the 0 neutrons is actually a proton. And therefore, that becomes the first neutron. So what we're saying is the proton and the neutron have a dependency. And that dependency is on the electron. So if we look at the atomic dependency, we can see that the neutron, which is based on the coming together of the matter, dark matter, and antimatter, and then it splits into two, the electron and the proton. Now, the electron and the proton come together. So what we're saying is that if there is a split from the neutron, that it is no longer a neutron, it is a proton. And the difference in mass, well, we're not sure, so we've been fudging it, but in the plasma science, we see that it's the release of the PM ticks. Now, based on surface to volume ratios, the PM ticks would be negative, which means they're magnetical. Isn't that what we said? The magnetical PM ticks are the principal matter. Well, now we know where it comes from. But if we look at the electron-proton ratio, then we say the electron is negative and the proton is positive. Well, wait a minute. Wait just a minute. Opposites repel in terms of polarity. I'm sorry. Opposites repel. Opposites attract. I'm sorry. Opposites attract in terms of polarity. The positive to the negative attracts. We know that from our playing with magnets. So how come the electron being negative and the proton being positive are separate? What caused that separation? So we say, well, it's the rotation of the electron around the proton. So the rate of rotation imparts a balance to separate the electron and the proton. But what's interesting is now that we have released that PM tick, the electron-proton marriage has a smaller surface to volume ratio than the neutron, and therefore becomes negative, and the neutron becomes positive. It's getting confusing. So now comes the positron. Now, what is a positron? Well, it is the antiparticle of an electron. And it has all the properties of an electron except for the polarity of the electric charge, which is positive. Therefore, a positron can simply be considered an electron having positive unit electrical charge. Well, if common polarities repel and opposite polarities attract, then obviously the positron would not be attracted to the proton because the proton is positive and so is the positron, except for the small problem that the positron has a higher surface to volume ratio, so it is negative, and the proton is positive, but the positron is equal to the electron. The electron is negative, and then the positron is positive. It's confusing. Well, how do we produce these positrons? And so they're produced when electrons interact with a tungsten target. Oh. They are then collected and guided by a magnetic system. Well, this is good. This is good. It's magnetical. And the system's novelty comes from the low energy of the incident electrons. Yes, electrons are tiny, so they have low energy compared to the proton. And it produces a positron beam with a strong dispersion in terms of energy and impulse. So does the electron then become consumed and becomes a positron? Well, how do you know it's a positron? I guess that depends. So there's a core dependency. So if an electron and a positron are kind of the same thing, only different charge, and you know it's an electron because it's smaller than a neutron, so that kind of depends, and the neutron depends on the electron. And then where do we fit in? And are we like for real? Are we a reflection? Are we an illusion? Or are we a shadow? What do we depend on? And which one of these do we depend on? So the thing about it is that we have an inner space containment. That is a mag-rav plus a magnetical. That's part of the creation. And we have a mag-rav plus a gravitational, which is part of the decay. And so it's this decay that brings the intensity, the gravitational intensity, which is balanced off by the magnetical out-tensity. So we can paraphrase that and say, well, the out tensity is part of our emission, and the absorption is part of the intensity. So the balance between the emission and the absorption is the inertia of the neutron. By extension, the balance of the out tensity with the intensity is the inertia of the neutron as well. So the inner space containment at the core becomes the inertia field of the neutron. Well, how long does it stay there? And I guess the answer is it depends. So the thing is that when we look at the balance, the gravitational conformation of the energy from the sun, the energy from the earth, and the energy from the universe, and we say, well, let there be light, and then we see the light, it becomes a hydrogen emission spectrum. But the hydrogen, we can't see it, but what we can see is the fingerprint. And that fingerprint manifests itself in color, which we can see the color because that's part of our physical gravitational tracking mechanism, and it's a unique fingerprint. And then, of course, we have oxygen. And the difference between the oxygen and the hydrogen is that the hydrogen has one electron and one proton, whereas the oxygen has 8 protons and 8 neutrons. So if we look at that spectrum, it depends on our point of view. So if we look at what the hydrogen absorbs, the hydrogen will absorb what it is, right? And it will reflect what it is not. So every color that you see in the absorption spectrum is what the hydrogen is not. But when you look at the emission spectrum of hydrogen, the only thing that you see are certain colors, and those are colors that are not reflected, but they're emitted. So if you were to look at the color spectrum and not decide on whether you're looking at hydrogen or anything else, then you would see all the colors. Because you would see all the colors that the hydrogen reflected and all the colors that the hydrogen emitted, and those colors are unique to whether or not they are absorbed or emitted. And the same holds true for the carbon. And of course, you look at the carbon and it has a lot more gaps. A lot more of the color is absorbed. And every single color that is absorbed is likewise emitted. And then when you look at the oxygen, it's even more dense and more lines are absorbed. And every single one of those lines is also part of the emission. So the spectrum dependency is dependent on whether you're looking at the absorption of the energy or the emission of the energy. So you have to remember that when you look at the person next to you, are you looking at their absorption spectrum or their emission spectrum? Which then means, are you looking at what their skin is reflecting, or are you looking at what their soul is emitting? And what does that depend on? Well, I think it depends on your point of view and your understanding. Now we're really going to mix everything up. Because you see, the hydrogen itself has dependency. And going back to 1937, we talked about orthohydrogen and parahydrogen. And what exactly is that? Well, you see, the hydrogen molecule has a spin. And so we know that the Earth rotates around its axis. It's a polar axis. So it rotates in a direction. Right now, who cares what direction? It rotates in a direction. But if it's an orthohydrogen, then that hydrogen has a covalent bond with another hydrogen, and that hydrogen rotates in the same direction. Well, if it rotates in the same direction, then like poles repel. So that's fine. And if we say that the repulsion of like poles is on the North Pole, and that is repelling, so you look at the South Pole, and that also is repelling. So you have a covalent bond that basically bonds the two hydrogens together in a straight line. But if you have a parahydrogen, the poles flip. So now the one hydrogen is rotating in one direction and the other hydrogen is rotating in the opposite direction. So opposite poles attract, but it can't attract because on the south side, the opposite poles are also attracting. So the balance on the North Pole is equal to the balance on the South Pole. So the covalent bond is a straight line. And interestingly enough, whether it's an orthohydrogen or a parahydrogen, we say it's still a hydrogen. So which hydrogen is it? And that actually depends. So there's a hydrogen dependency based on its environment, and we can change that. But at room temperature and the way we operate, we see that when we look at essential fatty acids, they are carbon linked, and we are organic beings, which means we are made of carbon. And these links are in a straight line, which means that the hydrogen on one side is in balance with the hydrogen on the other side. And then the next hydrogen is likewise in balance, so that each hydrogen depends on the other hydrogen. So whether it's from left to right or from top to bottom, they all depend on each other. They all balance out. And so that balance becomes a straight line. But we know that this straight line is actually a spiral because we understand that there's a third dimension and that energy is constantly in motion. And we know that that energy is either absorbed or it's emitted. But the thing is, it's both emitted and absorbed at the same time. And we know that because whichever color you want to look at the hydrogen spectrum for, you can see that it is either absorbed, which shows you the absence of light, or it is emitted, which shows the presence of light. But it is fulfilling. All the light shows, all the colors of light. So when we look at the fundamental principle of the twinity, there is a Gansev connection. And so if we take these two hydrogens and add oxygen, then you get water. And as we all know, that water quenches fire. How true is that statement? What about what happened with the Hindenburg, which was loaded with hydrogen? So the hydrogen burnt, but the hydrogen burned in the presence of oxygen. And so we know that if we bind oxygen with carbon, that quenches fire as well. But the difference here is that the carbon dioxide is heavier than air. So that would not have worked very good in the dirigible. So when we look at the hydrocarbons, which is the blending of the hydrogen with the carbon, it's an organic compound, but there is a difference. Now we have an aliphatic hydrocarbon, which is non-aromatic. And there are aromatic hydrocarbons. And the difference is they do not contain carbon-to-carbon double or triple bonds, but they can be branched or cyclic. So they can contain alternating single and double bonds. So they're no longer a straight line, they are bent. They have different shapes. And so we see that these shapes are reflected in our cell membranes, and all cells have membranes, and they're made of these fatty acids, which are chains of carbon aliphatic molecules. So they're in a straight line, but they are highly elastic and they're even fluidic. So we can see that there's a big difference in how they're created. But it's still carbon, it's still oxygen, and it's still hydrogen. And then we add in nitrogen, and now we have the amino acid that comprises the necessities that we have for amino food. And we are made of that. But so are the cows, chickens, and the fish. And so they become our food source, don't they? So if we look at the containment dependency, we look at the amino acids, we have hydrogen, nitrogen, and oxygen, which are gases, right? And what contains a gas? And so if we are able to contain hydrogen and we can see the color spectrum and it has a fingerprint, and then we see the nitrogen and it's different, and then we see the oxygen and it's different. And then we see the carbon, of course, which is a solid, but when it's combined with oxygen, it becomes a gas. And so the question then becomes, what contains the gas? So the gas itself, to be contained, has to be in a bag. Otherwise, it's not contained. That's what we did with the dirigible. We put the hydrogen in a big bag, and it was lighter than air, and so it floated. It had less mass. Oxygen was heavier mass. So the oxygen went to the bottom and displaced the hydrogen. So of all the elements that you're looking at here, the hydrogen has the least mass. Then we come back to the positron. And so we see that potassium, which is another element, when potassium-40 decays, it releases a positron, which is the electron's antimatter twin, remember? So you also contain a small amount of antimatter. So you, as a human, produce on average more than 4,000 positrons per day. That's about 180 per hour. I don't know who did the calculation, and I don't know how accurate it is. But the point is that there is a slight nuclear decay of the potassium, which means that there is a nuclear component. And we know that bananas are also a source of antimatter because they contain a tiny amount of radioactive form of potassium. And if you've ever tested it, you can put a Geiger counter next to a banana and it'll click. So as it decays, it produces positrons, and that clicking is the positron. That's the antimatter counterpart of electrons, isn't it? So the problem is if we have an electron, an anti-electron, which we call a positron, it would also repel the proton since it has a positive charge. So then positrons are mathematically equivalent to electrons, but they're actually moving backwards in time. Oh dear. So now we're introducing a new subject, electrons going forward in time and positrons going backward in time. So it's a good thing there's a balance, isn't there? Because otherwise we wouldn't even have the present, especially since we're only producing 180 positrons an hour. But anyway, that's another subject. The point of the matter is that we all have a cell boundary, and that boundary is a balance between the magnetical and gravitational field forces. And so we have the neutron that's in the middle, and we have the electrons on the outside. And how many do we have? And what is the difference? Because not all cells are the same. Some are kidney cells, some are heart cells, some are leg cells. And so all of them are created through this plasma chain, and there's a gravitational neutron at the core of this plasma chain. So that neutron depends on its environment. And so the cellular structure also depends on that. And the cellular structure then has a balance field of the external tensity and the internal pressure. And so this pressure becomes part of the physicality. But there's a bond between all the cells. Without that bond, then you would need a bag. So the covalent bonding of the hydrogen on the surface is the bag that holds the plasma chain together, isn't it? And we know that there's an out-tensity interaction because we have an absorption and an emission spectrum, and they are equal and opposite. So the cell becomes the bag, except we now have helium-4. And helium-4 is a stable isotope of the element helium. Now we said that hydrogen-1 has 1 proton and helium has 2 protons. But helium has 2 neutrons. And hydrogen doesn't have any neutrons. So the in-between stage, that 1 neutron element is missing. Unless, of course, we substitute the proton for the neutron with the hydrogen and we say, well, the hydrogen-1 is a neutron, but for the sake of the periodic table of elements, we will call it a proton so that the periodic table will make sense because the numeric numbers on the periodic table of elements reflect the number of protons. Because clearly it cannot depend on the number of neutrons because the number of neutrons is variable and it all depends. So now the problem with helium is that it is by far the more abundant of the 2 naturally occurring isotopes of helium, making about, well, close to 100% of the helium on Earth. and its nucleus is identical to an alpha particle, which consists of 2 protons and 2 neutrons. There you go. Well, this gas dependency has been harvested by NASA because it uses helium to keep hot gases and ultra-cold liquid fuels separated. Think about that for a moment. We're keeping gases separated during liftoff of rockets. In fact, in arc welding, it uses helium to create an inert gas shield. And similarly, divers and others working under pressure can use a mix of helium and oxygen to create a safe artificial breathing atmosphere. As we know, in our atmosphere, the oxygen ratio is about 18 to 21%, depending. So an artificial breathing atmosphere would have to have that ratio. So the helium is used to do that. And how can the helium do that? Because if we look at the mixture dependency of helium, and here is the spectrum of helium, and now we know that this is the absorption spectrum. So the colors that we don't see are the colors that helium absorbs. And so rest assured that the colors that helium emits will fill in those gaps. But then we look at the oxygen and we say, well, wait a moment. The oxygen is totally different from the helium, but it still has those gaps. Now, if we were to mix this helium and oxygen together, well, guess what? The gaps that the helium has do not overlap the gaps that the oxygen has. And the gaps that the oxygen has do not overlap the gaps that the helium has. So quite clearly, that if you looked at the mixture dependence of this sample, it would specifically say that there is helium and oxygen in there. Helium is a gas. Oxygen is a gas. How can the helium gas remain contained within the oxygen gas? And if we're saying that the oxygen gas is 18 to 21% in an environment that is considered safe, then in this example, we would have to say that the oxygen gas is contained within the helium gas, and that there is definitely a boundary between the two gases. So that boundary between the two gases is neither a bag or a balloon or something physical. Because whatever is binding the helium and the oxygen, it's self-contained, and it's a non-visible plasma field. So if we look at the spectrum and we want to see the balance, and we want to see the balance between the ultraviolet and the infrared, do we say that the equal sign is down the middle in the green section? So if we look at the helium, we can clearly see that there are more gaps on the blue side than there are in the red side. But if we look at the oxygen, we can see that there are more gaps on the red side than on the blue side. And then if we look at the mixture, well, you know, the whole discussion goes out the window because you can't really tell, but what you do know is that the helium is in a balanced state, the oxygen is in a balanced state, and the helium-oxygen mixture is in a balanced state. So which is it? Is it the balance of the left and the right? Or is it the balance between the lower energy state and the higher energy state? Well, the lower energy state, we can certainly understand that. Okay. If I have meat and I have potatoes, I know which one is which. But if I get into the plasma state and I can't see it, I can't touch it, how do I know which one's which? So what we can see is that we have a difference in susceptibility between the physicality of the atomic, nano, and GaN state, and we have a difference in the susceptibility of the plasmatic side of the atomic, nano, and GaN state. Because there has to be a difference in the plasmatic state, because what would allow the helium to be contained? We can't see the helium in the physical state anyway. So now we can't see it in the plasma state, but we can see the fingerprint. So we know that the fingerprint is for sure in the physical state. But the containment, where's the containment from? So as our observation, we're in the observer dimension. So we're looking at the gravitational neutron, which is the physical inertia. And that depends on the gravitational neutron, which is a field inertia. And that field inertia depends on a plasma inertia. And since we are the observers, that all of us, that includes all of us, all includes all, everybody, we are part of the humanity inertia. So if we look at the colors of the spectrum and we see that the colors are different, and we see that the color spectrum, it could some be in the blue side, it could some be in the red side, there's no discrimination of color there. Why does humanity discriminate by the color of the reflection or the color of the emission? We're all part of the observer dimensions, and we're all dependent on the environment, that same environment, by the same rules. So our humanity is a gravitational confirmation of the energy coming from the universe, the same way. And the containment is following the same rules. And the positioning of our Earth is following the same rules in relationship to the other planets and the sun. So all of this is dependent on the rules that are coming from the universal community. So the only gravitational confirmation we have of the man-made laws is those that we apply to it. But it does not always comply with the universal laws. And that's where the problem sits in. So the explanation of the energy sequencing, sure, we have the lowest energy, which is magnetic, then we electric, electromagnetic, atomic, and we progress. nuclear and plasma. We go beyond nuclear, the soul of the body and the soul of the man. And all of these have a sequencing. And then we find out it's always a two-way street. And in that two-way street, we have a balance between the outtensity and the intensity. So it involves the emission and the absorption, and you need both. If you don't have both, it doesn't exist. So in terms of the Earth space, we have to have the bringing together of these plasma fields, which manifest the Earth space. It is then that we understand that in order to manifest that, it had to have come from outer space. And if the Earth came from outer space, then we came from outer space. So this becomes part of the transmutation state. And just because we can't see it doesn't mean it doesn't exist, because clearly we are here in physicality. Clearly the Earth is here in physicality. And as according to the difference between the helium and the oxygen spectrum, we can clearly see that there is a containment that is not visible. So there's a substitution, it's a transference of the gravitational dominance. And at that point of substitution, the intensity equals zero and the outtensity equals zero. But the gravitational conformation remains. Or the gravitational conformation will dissolve. Something is always something as opposed to being something else. And so that substitution point is within the black hole field. And what we need to know is it going to maintain itself? So it has to have a Magrav state. That's the fundamental basis of the atomic principle. In order to have an atomic atom, you have to have an electron and a proton. You have to have both. And yet there are opposite charges which should attract and become one, but they're one in terms of being an atom. But they're obviously separated, and we can separate them further into a monatomic state we call nano, and then the polyatomic, and then the plasma state. And then we can go one step beyond that. Well, if we can go one step beyond on one direction, we can go one step beyond the other direction, because what is holding the atmosphere of the Earth inside the Earth's atmosphere? And we call it the Coulomb barrier. And it's a bag, isn't it? But we can't see the bag. Just like we can't see the bag that's holding the oxygen within the helium. And yet, here we have the Earth space being fed by these plasma fields, and we create minerals like gold, which becomes the food of this planet. And if it's the food of the planet, it's also the food for us, because we are in the same field as the planet. So our soul tunes in to the planet. And in order to understand how to manifest on this planet, you have to provide that pattern. When you provide the pattern, then you get the energy. And so we see the fundamental pattern is the amino acid in the star formation. From there, you get the energy, because then you receive it. And from there, everything builds. So we look at the soul and how it's dependent on the relationship between the carbon-14, the carbon-13, and the carbon-12. And so we find that there's an intensity feeding and there's an out-tensity feedback. And because there's an imbalance, there's this 80-20%, which is kind of like the relationship between the nitrogen and the oxygen. So in terms of the relationship of helium and oxygen to create a stable environment that is suitable for breathing, it's 80-20%. Isn't our environment the same? And isn't it interesting that when we breathe it in, we also breathe it out, and it contributes to that environment. So There's an intensity feeding and an outensity feedback. So there's a soul dependency. So if we're matter state dependent, we are coming from a point of weakness. So we cannot exert our strength as a point of weakness. So this is where, when you're looking at the balance of the pH, we have to see that in order to balance these fields, the speed of rotation has an effect, because otherwise the electron will never stay apart from the proton, would it? So this affects the transmutation transition, doesn't it? And this is why our planet is blue, right? Because this is an intensity and outensity balancing. And so that becomes the physical coloring of the planet. But this planet overall is a blue planet, but it has every color of the rainbow in it. And so all of these colors are part of the planet. So they should be part of the piece. And we shouldn't discriminate by color, because the color doesn't matter. There are many points on this field strength of the dove, and that's what matters. And this is why we need to do more research on the space plasma and bring together the Keshe Foundation to carry on this research. And part of it has been the transmutation flight testing, which we're now in the middle of February, March, and April to do this training. And it's an ongoing process, because 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, we are told do not, cannot, and clearly not doesn't work, because we are in heaven and we're part of the transmutation process. So this range transition transcends the inertia field transmutation dimensions. So the laws of conservation are governed by the covalent, the trivalent, and the tetravalent bonding attributes, right? And so this containment of inertia is manifest through the contention of equality. We had the containment of the inertia of the helium. We had the containment of the inertia of the oxygen. And then we had the containment of the inertia of the two together. So it doesn't come from the physicality. Neither does our humanity. The soul of the man cannot be abandoned, because the soul of the man cannot be compromised. There's an integrity. The color of man is based on the integration with the soul of man. This is the integrity of man. So we have an inertia, unity, dependency. It's based on pathling and susceptibility, and we have to take more into account part of the emission of what we are giving our attention to, and part of the emission of the retention, that which we absorb. And so this interacts to create the emission of intention, right? Because this creates a balance of the contention of equality. That is how it's done. So we have to set up our antenna to take in the transmission from the message feeding and the feedback manifestation. And we have to tune this transition. So we can select one force, which is magnetical, and balance it by the force selection of another gravitational force. And the result is the MAGRAV manifestation. So this manifestation is predetermined by us choosing. We choose the peace dome of intention, because that becomes our emission of intention. And it affects the standard folding deviation, so that it leaves no room for war. Then transmutation manifests in balance with the peace dome. That is the greater oneness. And that's how we transcend the limitations of nuclear science, which we have been delivering for 578 weeks through the Knowledge Seekers workshops. And we continue to do so because this is the Keshe Foundation Spaceship Institute Teachings of Plasma Science, and we're welcoming all the beautiful knowledge seekers to learn about the new selection process of the new plasma science. There's a World Peace Treaty. We need to choose it. we need to sign it. We need to do it with our emotion, our strength, the real strength. So as four-wheelers, we're in a three-dimensional feeding inertia. And there are no straight lines to connect the dots of the fields of inertia. So can man go into outer space without a peace dome? Not really. And is the inertia of the present governed by the dimensions of history? If that's what we allow. So how do we impart the transition of energy states of inertia? So the inertia of the physical transmission dimensions are dependent on each inertia of the plasma fields themselves, right? And the plasma science, therefore, is being delivered daily to reinforce via the peace dome, to reinforce the need for the exchange for peace on Earth. For some reason, we still need to teach this every day. Welcome to the new outer space age. This is the end of the lesson. Thank you all. I hope you enjoyed this trip.
Thank you, Alex. Let's see if any of the participants have a question. Gosh, so many energies and so many different ways to put them together. You must have created some systems by now. It does sound like you have a deep understanding of this. Have you solved the riddle or the puzzle?
Solving the riddle is not the proper question, because life is for learning and we learn every day. But the thing that we need to learn and we need to put forward to everybody is that we have to stop being matter state dominant. So we have always been plasma state solutions. We have always been the plasma state inertia dimension. But we have always wanted to guide ourselves with the physical state impetus. We need to understand the difference and allow it to happen. Because do you believe your experiences? So the experiences are your feedback? Or do you experience your beliefs? The beliefs are the feeding. And so the evidence is everywhere that what we think we see, we really don't see. Because a gas is contained by its environment. So a solid has no problem, right? It's solid. It's contained by its solidness. But water flows, liquids flow, they ooze or whatever. So you need a containment, you need a vessel, you need a glass, you need a tub, right? You need a pond, you need an ocean, something to contain the water. But air, like once you put the gas in the air, once you let the gas out, go ahead, see what you can do to catch it. So what is containing the gas? Well, the gas will take its environment. But, how come the gas only goes so high and then it doesn't go anymore? And how come the helium can maintain its presence within the mixture. We know it's there because we can see the signature, and we can see the signature of the oxygen. And the reason we can see that signature is because they're both clear. They're both in a gaseous state, and they're both colorless. So we can see the physical spectrum. So we know they're in there. And yet, you look at the other gases, and what is in there? You don't know what's in there because they all have a unique fingerprint, which is what makes them elements. But when you combine the two, if you were to combine carbon and oxygen and get carbon dioxide, now, you know, it's neither carbon nor oxygen. It's carbon dioxide. Totally different. Whereas if you blend helium and oxygen, you can clearly see that there's helium and there's oxygen. So there are some rules that we clearly don't understand. And you say, well, why? I'm not a scientist, or what does that have to do with my little tiny perfect world? You know, what can I do to change this? Well, what you have to understand is that your environment is your manifestation, is your creation, is your containment, and your point of view matters. So if it's raining today and you look outside and you say, oh, what a terrible day, it's raining. And someone else looks outside, oh, it's so wonderful. Let's go walk in the rain. And so, well, wait a second. The day is the same. It's a rainy day. And yet here's someone who has a viewpoint that it's a bad day, and here's someone who has a viewpoint that it's a wonderful day. Well, how can you have two different viewpoints from the same point of view? Because it's not the same point of view. The manifestation of the physicality is the same point of view. But the experience comes from a different belief. So one believes it's a lousy day and one believes it's a wonderful day. And so that point of view creates the inertia field, right? So we need to be facilitators to make it a peaceful world. You can't continue to complain and be a victim, or you can't continue to complain by continuing to do the things that impact others in a negative way. So there's a dependency. You depend on others and you depend on yourself. But first, today's subject was dependency. So your point of view is dependent on your point of view. So how can you, as a singular, depend on a singular point of view? Because it's not a singular point of view. It is an inertia point of view brought together by two inertia fields, the soul of the man and the soul of the physicality. So when you're standing there alone and trying to figure out how this world works, you have to understand, first of all, you're not alone. It's not just you and your shadow. It's you, your soul, and you, your physicality, and soul of physicality. You're never alone. This is the message.
Okay, thank you, Alex. Let's see if anyone else has a question or something they'd like to share. Hopefully you've written down one question for Alex. You know, when you talked about the universe and the matter state, we know it's only 5%, but isn't the Earth within the universe? So these two dimensions of physicality and energy are existing all across the universe. It shouldn't be anything strange. Earth being matter, I know it's a plasma, but matter state plasma. It's existing in the dimension of energy in the universe. I mean, all around its surroundings. Most of the universe is only 5% matter state or less. So the two dimensions are existing simultaneously. And as he said, we can operate in both. So I was just thinking about that, being the Earth and all the matter state components in the universe. They're coexisting all the time in the energy dimension, aren't they?
That's brilliant, Mark. Absolutely brilliant. Because let's face it, you are working on the Earth space, but at the same time, the Earth is maintaining its position between Mars and Venus, right?
Yes, the whole thing is maintaining its position based on the sun. I think, as we know, it moves millions of miles in each direction to keep that balance going.
Yeah, so you have the balance between the planets that's between the Earth and the Sun, and the planets that's beyond the Earth and the outer limits of the solar system, of this particular solar system.
But I'm saying the Earth has to move. I mean, the sun has to move to sort of, if anything sort of gets out of balance or whatever, I think the sun has to do the correction of it to bring it back into where it was by its position, moving or changing. And that creates the beautiful, smooth, for the most part, peaceful operation of the solar system.
And so this is why we see that less energy is required to keep a complex organism in balance than an element. Less energy.
Okay, anyone else would like to make a question, or have you something you'd like to add here?
Well, let's let people contemplate this, and I could take the opportunity to thank everybody for allowing me to continue to prepare these sessions. And you know, we're all on this same course together. And please remember that there are other people who are of various degrees of understanding and of knowledge and of awareness, and they need to be brought along, and they need to be brought along in a welcoming manner, okay? Because this is heaven. This is what it is. And if in your tiny perfect world you're not living in heaven, then there's something wrong. And that's the first lesson. And then it's easier to look for what's right. So you just reverse the polarity, if you will, and then practice that. So in the few hours that we're together, and it seems like a long session, and I respect all the people on the panel who stick it out, if you will. But, you know, every week we endeavor to make sure that we don't waste people's time. It's new information, it's relevant information, and we try and keep up to date with the changing times and current events and move ahead. And we see that there is a definite relationship between those factors, things that we do and things that are part of our ever-changing landscape on this planet. So this is a totally dynamic, and it's not in a vacuum. It's all working together within this inertia field we call Earth space, and we are part of that. So we all arrived here by the same rules. We all live here by the same rules. And the Earth space is already showing us how some of those rules work. So we are really negligent if we choose to ignore that just because we can't see it. So if you're, you know, in a touchy-feely world where what you see is what you believe, you're missing the majority of the picture. And it's, you know, it's very interesting in the comments section. Sometimes you go in a place where they have bloggers and someone comes in late and they put in the message, what did I miss? Did I miss anything important? And you just kind of want to say, well, now that you're here, we're going to discuss the important stuff. But, you know, really what you need to say is, well, you know, you've missed all the important stuff, so there's nothing, you know, more that's going to come about. Well, the whole purpose of us coming together is because we all have this need. And if we don't have this need, we wouldn't be here. But this need is not just to reinforce, because that's what bloggers do, isn't it? They get together and they have a pity party and say, oh, you know, this is bad, this is bad, this is bad. Yes, yes, this is bad. But can you do that and offer a solution? Say, okay, well, this is bad, but this is what we need to do. And this is the whole nature of the business. So we have to understand that we cannot blame the broom for bringing together all the dust. The dust was there. The broom just swept it together. Then it became visible. It went from being tolerable, to being intolerable. Get the dustpan out, pick up that dirt, and now you've got a clean room. So you don't sit there and blame the broom and say, well, if it wasn't for the broom, we wouldn't have all this dust. That dust is there. So we are the broom, and it becomes our responsibility every day to make sure that our life is operating properly. And if we don't know, then we have to learn. And if we can't be dependable, then we have to enlist the services of someone else who is dependable. And the thing about dependency is you cannot depend on undependable people, except for the fact that they are dependably undependable. So that you have to determine, and you can't always determine that by the physicality. You have to look at the true intention of their soul. And when they say, well, I'll see you later, when exactly is that later? And then you have those who want to be a little bit more specific, and they say, I'll see you tomorrow. And by my clock, tomorrow is 24 hours. And then I don't see them for a year, and you say, what planet are you from? Well, the Keshe Foundation Knowledge Seekers workshops are every week. That's our true intention. And the North American team meetings are every week, and that's our intention. And are we unique? We're just an electron when you compare what the Brazilians are doing. They're more like a proton loaded with power, loaded with good intention, built for success. That's a model. And we're trying to do the same model over here. The only difference is we're a little bit smaller. But we will get there because that's our intention. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Mark.
Right. Anyone else want to make a comment? Ask a question? Make a statement? Let's try this one, Alex. I'm reading out of the transcript from about minute 42, a little past that. This is why I have said many times, when you look at the star, what you see, what it is now, not what 120 million light years ago. Your physicality sees 120 million light years ago. Your soul sees instantaneous what is now. If you understand this, then you understand more and more why we always said that man has a connection with the hydrogen, which is the deuterium hydrogen, and not the hydrogen as a proton and electron. It's a full system with emotion and understanding. This is why it can travel the span of the universe through non-dimensional soul of it. So when you look at a star, did you ever see a difference between your physical and your soul? Maybe I've never tried to look at it on the soul level, but I don't ever remember seeing a difference or seeing it instantaneous what it is now. Anyone want to share something about that?
Well, I'll just chime in, Mark. I have seen stars move,
Oh, sure.
which means that they're actually not stars as we know them, as fixed bodies. But when I say I've seen them move, I'm not talking about the motion as, you know, the Earth is moving and it's causing the star to move across the sky as a planet might move across the sky. But the star was actually changing its position and adjusting. So it wasn't just standing there, if you will, and just kind of drifting. It's like when you look at a satellite, you know, that's orbiting around the planet. You know, there's some satellites you can see, like the International Space Station. You can see that with your naked eye. But when you look at a star and it's kind of bouncing, and so, wait a second, that's a different kind of movement. So it's kind of hovering, but it's not hovering in the same spot. And it's hard to explain if you don't recognize that, you know, there are other things that maybe you don't have the skill to explain. So just because you don't have the skill to explain it, or you don't know how to explain it, doesn't mean it doesn't exist. This is the point. So you don't have to be a scientist to understand this. There are practical demonstrations all around, all the time. So, it's like if you're asking how can you change the color, ask a chameleon, you know. How can you replace a limb? Ask a salamander. How can you change your conformity? You have to ask a butterfly.
As he said, we haven't reached the understanding of a lizard who can grow its own tail if it loses it.
But we have been able to reach the understanding of how we repair a scratch on our skin. That we can do. So, we have limited success. So
Yeah, I
now,
was just wondering if anyone had seen the difference in a star between looking at it with the physical eye and the soul of the man, and what is reported in that process. Anyone?
it's a tough question, Mark, but I'll tell you what,
He stated it many times.
the thing about it is what I've never considered is that which I don't see. And what we don't see, when we look up into the sky, is the mass of blackness. So the mass of the blackness is way more than the light of what we see, the light of the stars. And I know, like, there's millions of stars out there, but the thing is, they're all stars, they're all dots, if you will, in the visible spectrum. That the rest of it is in the non-visible spectrum. So what is that? That's the question that I have. And where is it? And why can't we see it? Well, we can't see it is because it's going away from us at the speed of light. So then the question becomes is where is it going? And if it's going at the speed of light in physicality, then if the speed of light was the fastest speed, then we'd never be able to catch it. But when we transmute into the plasma state, we can go faster than the speed of light. So at that point in time, then we can catch it. And this is the whole point of the reality. So
Even in a craft, I think you can catch it. We can go hundreds of thousands of times the speed of light in a craft.
Yeah, but you see, again, it's imposing another limitation because you're going in a containment within a containment. And what we need to graduate to is to be able to go without that containment.
Absolutely.
So we know that it's possible because when we see the spectrum of the helium and the oxygen combination, I'm telling you, this is a very special observation. I didn't realize how special it was. I don't even know what's special. I wasn't brought up in that environment. Okay, I'm trying to find the practical application of that. Well, the practical application is that clearly a gas can maintain its personality as a gas within a containment that is not physical. Okay, well, if the gas can do that, then surely our soul can do that. It just stands to reason. Don't say it's not possible. It is possible. We have the color spectrum to prove it, that it is possible. So don't say it's not possible. Just say the truth. I don't know. And if you don't know, now you know what you need to look for. So, if we don't know specific things, can we carry on without having to know that specific thing? Sure, because they all follow the same rules. It comes from the top down. The plasma feeds the physicality. So you either experience your beliefs or you believe your experience. So you come back from a trip and you say, you know, how was the trip? Well, it wasn't what I thought it would be. So you were disappointed. I guess if you'd have thought it would have been a good trip, you wouldn't have come back disappointed. But at least you now know the difference, and that you have to take as a positive thing, right? From the failure, you see the success. If you don't see the success coming out of the gate, then you could have success, you could have failure. But if you have the failure, then you don't need to repeat that. So now you can look at the success. And you can have the confidence that it is success. And so this is how we can navigate through life. It's really absolutely wonderful, because in the absence of that understanding, Earth is depressing.
It is a harsh environment at the moment
Yeah,
for
that's
many,
sure.
many, no question, but we can transmute it into something peaceful and kind and beautiful, as it's a beautiful place in the matter state, the most beautiful place in the matter state in the universe.
Well said. Thank you, Mark. I'll talk to you later.
Yes, thank you, Alex.